in the submission of the appeal, we didn't have any supplementary documentation provided to support any kind of cohort change during those appeal and audit windows. The other thing I do want to note is just that Indiana code, and this was in the hearing officer determination, Indiana code is pretty clear that once a student is placed in a cohort, they belong to one cohort only. So for data purposes, for data accuracy and data reliability, that's the stance that the department has upheld because it's statutorily required of us. As long as I have been there, yes. I'm not sure I understand what the New Palestine issue was. I'm happy to look at that, but I don't know exactly what you're referring to with that. Tim, did you have any comments?
I just wanted to follow up and say that the recommendation is that if the school has data proving that there's a data error, inconsistency, whatever you want to call it, that they be provided the opportunity at this time to provide that data for the department's consideration. Now, if the data doesn't actually prove that, or if the data is insufficient, then that's up to the department can decline to make that change. But I'm saying that if there is the data to prove that, I'm recommending, if there is the data to prove that there is an error, that they be provided the opportunity to submit that data for the department's consideration.
Question I would have is I guess for you would be, how long have you known about this error, and if the data has not been submitted to the DOE yet, why not? The change in data, so they can make their changes. Am I correct with that, Superintendent?
Yes, correct, Maggie. So the problem becomes is if they've already been submitted in a certain cohort, it is difficult to change them, correct?
You don't change cohort unless it's an error on the department's end, or if it's so egregious such as, so like in that instance, on that audit for those two students that were not the data error on the department side. There were, from that period, then there's the appeal window. School also has the opportunity to submit evidence and documentation during the appeal window. From the file that we received, I did not have any documentation to support that. So those are the two opportunities we have in the process of the audit and the appeal windows.
Question for
Dr. Freitas?
Tim, I have a question for you. Is this their final appeal today? Because if they provide data and DOE doesn't accept it, do they have a right to another appeal back to us, or is this it today? And if so, if this is it today, are you in agreement that if you submit data to DOE that they don't accept, then you understand it's over? Is that correct?
I understand it's over. We have submitted EM reports, but since the PE report is the only thing that's allowed, then we feel like we have no other reports that we can offer. So we have transcripts, so we have EM reports, and we have EM reports from that year that corrected the error. But since the PE report on count day is the official report, we feel like we have no other recourse except for trying to explain our position, not recognizing the error until this year.
Okay, so you're taking a risk by, and it's a good risk, I think, that you're going to present data to DOE. If they accept it, fine. If they don't accept it, then you're okay with that. Correct. And so we can move on today.
Correct.
And support the motion.
Correct.
Is there a question about is the question from your perspective around timeline? Because I heard Maggie talk about timelines, or is it an issue of data accuracy?
It's a question of data accuracy because it will continue to affect us moving forward regarding our graduation rate and from what we understand the next couple of years.
So is your firm belief that you have 2 students misclassified?
Correct.
So if you can prove that, then it's not a timeline issue. It is simply data. And that was, I think, the fundamental question. Right? Brian, you asked a question a moment ago, and I don't think we got an answer to it. I was just curious. You mentioned New Palestine. What does that have to do with this particular issue?
So, New Palestine was a school, this was an article that was published recently, and it was where the department worked with New Palestine School, where they had their grad rate was calculated incorrectly as a result of mistakes by the school, and the department was working with that school to make sure that their grad rate got corrected. And so that's the similarity that I was trying to.
Maggie?
Clarification on that. So that's a result of the 2017 graduation rate audit, and that was part of the New Palestine issue. So it's not an issue of data submission through the PE of placement of cohorts, an issue of sufficient mobility to support a mobility code. It's a different issue than establishing which cohort a student is in. So just a little clarification on that issue.
Do we have a motion yet?
We do. We have a motion on the floor to approve the,
I apologize. I realize I never answered Dr. Grace's question.
go ahead.
So this is not what I would call the last appeal. This is the last stage of their appeal, because once the board votes, obviously the grade becomes finalized. And if you have questions about the sufficiency of the data that's ultimately provided, assuming this appeal is granted in respect to that, I'm sure we could schedule a meeting or a phone call or follow up with the department to find out, what kind of data was submitted and what was the result of that.
Yeah, I, as one board member, I'd be curious to see what the resolution is in this instance.
Maggie,
It sounds like seems to be some ambiguity, so it would just be information piece, so it wouldn't be an appeal of any kind. And obviously, I want to support what DOE's doing. I'm just curious to see how it does turn out.
One last comment, and then we'll take a vote. Maggie?
Yeah, one thing I'm not sure of what the actual recommendation is, but just to be clear on whatever the vote is, if there's a motion, I believe the recommendation is to approve the changes. So I just wanted to make sure that the board was privy to that before making any sort of motion, because it doesn't, just based on the discussion, there seems to be some discussion that could be contrary to what that recommendation actually says.
So
unless
Tim,
I'm
can you clarify
misinterpreting.
that, please?
The recommendation from me is that they be permitted to provide additional data to the department for review and consideration as part of the graduation program for those two students.
Just one more.
Thus opening like a third window.
Again,
And I'm just
understand-
clarifying,
Yes.
that's what you're asking. Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
Just one more comment. We've dealt with this similar sorts of situations since late summer through now. And I think it's time to move on and let's have a vote.
So we have a motion and a second, correct? Roll call, please.
Dr. Burton,
Yes.
Dr. Ernest,
Yes.
Dr. Freitas,
Yes.
Mr. Henry,
Yes.
Ms. Moe,
Yes.
Mr. Walker. Yes. Mr. Watts,
Yes.
Ms. Wicker,
Yes.
Dr. Granger.
Yes.
Superintendent Flynn.
No. Thank you. Ambassador Christian Academy Choice Scholarship Waiver.
Good afternoon, Superintendent and
Good
members of the
afternoon.
board. My name is Danielle Graham Harris, and I am the new principal at Ambassador Academy. I come before you today appealing and requesting a delay of consequences. Ambassador Academy did receive 2 Ds accountability-wise over the past 2 years. However, this year, we've done some things in restructuring the school. The first thing being bringing in a new administrator. Second, reorganizing the staff, where we have 30% of the teachers that are certified and a request of the other teachers to get into a state certified program or to finish the programs that they currently have. We are also focusing on improving teaching and learning and changing adult practices. We've put a lot of work into monitoring the learning that is going on. We do that by utilizing the Indiana Standards, the Indiana Standards Aligned Lesson Plan template, which allows us to maintain our focus and to be intentional. It pushes the teachers to answer the question of what are students expected to do and how will you know. We have also incorporated in weekly professional embedded, embedded weekly professional development. And more importantly, it is about advocating for the students of the Gary School community. As you heard earlier, it is a community that is suffering. However, at our school, we are able to address the whole child. It is a Christian school. We do academically push the children to be college and career ready. But when we think about character development and social emotional learning, we're also having the opportunity to pour into the students so that they become good citizens and believers of Christ. Our biggest thing is making certain that we're there for the students, that they are a priority, and that we're preparing and training our instructors to handle the diverse needs of each learner that comes across. The voucher is needed because many of the parents in the community without the voucher are unable to afford any amount of tuition, and the other schools within the Gary Community School System unfortunately are failing. So the choices that they have when it comes to where they will send their students to learn is very limited. For that, I am asking the board to please consider giving us an additional year. We have partnered with Catapult Learning, though it was a struggle. We were unable to get that incorporated until January of this year for our Title I students, who we all know are our lowest performing students. But we do have that in place, and it did just begin in January. Thank you.
Thank you. Tim?
I'm really just here to answer any questions regarding the waiver memo that was sent to the board members.
So your recommendation, can you restate that,
Yes,
please?
of course. After reviewing the materials submitted by the school and reviewing the applicable statute, ultimately the staff recommendation is to not grant the waiver based off of the school remaining at the same status as a D for 2 years in a row. As the board may recall, in previous times when this has come up, it was just last year, this is a new, relatively new law, we struggled with defining how to define academic improvement from the preceding year, which is the language from the statute. Ultimately, and of course the board can always revise its approach, ultimately the approach seems to be, that was settled on, was looking at the letter grade as the best overall indicator of that school and determining whether or not that school has demonstrated academic progress from the preceding year. So last year, and I believe maybe it was May, a number of these waivers were approved with schools that had gone from D's or F's to B's or A's. That was the rationale. The rationale is that the grades will take you into the consequence phase, that your grades will take you out of your consequence phase, which they will do eventually. This particular law or statute simply allows that to happen faster or delay those consequences.
So if we as a board agree with your recommendation, no motion would be necessary.
Still vote. I think
I
still,
think
I
it's
think there's still a
it would be
motion to approve.
to adopt the recommendation not to grant the waiver.
Okay. Either way.
How many students you have?
Right.
We have one school currently. There was a time in the past where they did have high school, but we have one school currently.
Total, how many students?
205, K-8, it is 168.
And all those students are there by choice.
5 students are not there by choice.
Any other questions? Do we have a motion to?
I'm going to make a
Dr.
motion
Yeager?
to approve the waiver.
Do we have a second? Any other comments, Dr. Yeager?
Yeah, I'm a little confused now. So if we do not, okay, if we end up adopting the recommendation from staff, do you, it's still confusing in the way this is written for me. Do we lose, Tim, do they lose all their scholarships, or do they cannot expand their scholarships?
And I know this is a very confusing memo. The way that the law works is very confusing because there's multiple stages and there's a delay because when the grades come out.
Okay.
What would happen is they would not be able to accept new choice scholarship students for the next school year.
So whoever's there could continue to receive, okay.
Absolutely. That helps.
Clarification, is the motion to approve the staff recommendation?
Is to approve the waiver request.
But, so the staff's recommendation was not to approve it, but you're saying the motion is
My motion to approve the waiver.
to approve the waiver. So is there a second to that? There's a second. Okay,
So
any
it's
other,
opposite of
The
the
board
staff
recommendation.
recommendation. Okay, I was just confused.
Dr. Yeager?
You want to go first?
Oh, go ahead.
Tim, is there past practice here? Do we have precedents of these kinds of requests that,
It's limited, as I mentioned, really, the board's only reviewed this type of request 2 times in the past, this last year, based off of the waiver requests that have been approved by the board in the past. Those were schools that demonstrated a letter grade improvement. I don't know about if that sets precedent from one time, but that's what the board did previously.
Does it matter where these children are coming from? And I'm just curious. I mean, I think if you look at the overall conditions and the school district that a lot of these children are in, they're coming from Gary Community Schools, right?
Yes, sir, they are.
Right, and I think we have to, from my perspective, that is a major consideration, is that I know where they're coming from.
Yes.
And so if we grant the waiver, that is essentially giving them 1 more year, correct? Because they'd be under the same situation a year from now.
So I would also, Senator Melton's here. Senator Melton, would you like to come up and add any comments? Sure.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
You're not very busy these days, are you? I'm so happy you're here and not there.
No, I heard some of my constituents here, so I wanted to come and just
Absolutely. Thank you for
show some
coming.
support. Well, I definitely want to just rise in support of granting another year. And just like you mentioned, Doctor, there's been a lot of transition in the city as a whole, not just within the district. I think with a lot of the changes, giving them another year to adjust and address some of the issues of shifting the population and bringing in new students will give them opportunity. I'm not sure what has been done leading up to it, in collaboration with the state board staff in terms of opportunities to address issues, but maybe just looking at certain benchmarks being set to hit some targets. Just wanted to share the concern I have of, I know they do a great job, just for full transparency's sake, my children went to this school. So I have to definitely come and share that, and they're doing great right now. So I just wanted to come share my support for them and just share that with my former colleagues and friends that's on the board. So thank you for the time.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks. Appreciate you coming over. Dr. Freitas?
I have a question for Tim. Tim, you've been quoting the statute, and it is listed here. And I'm trying to distinguish what's in the statute and how much flexibility we have, because we should be following statutes, I assume. And what you have listed here, it seems that one of the key indicators is demonstrated academic improvement. Is that your language, or is that the statutory language?
That is statutory language. I'll read the quote here from the statute. It's, quote, if the eligible school demonstrates that a majority of students in the eligible school demonstrated academic improvement during the preceding school year, end quote.
So that's the statute, and we need to follow it. Is that correct? We need to follow the statute, or the statute needs to be changed? Or can we ignore statutes on this board?
If you ask me as an attorney, please follow the statute. And that was the basis for the recommendation.
So if that's the case, then, and I'm okay maybe supporting this, but I need to know, how is the school, according to the statute, demonstrated academic improvement? So you've been talking about sort of input things. I guess I'm looking for output things. How has the school demonstrated academic improvement in the preceding year? Because that's what the statute says.
So in the preceding years, in your packet, they've actually demonstrated improvement in the area of growth. While we have not been able to completely close the achievement gap and to hit the benchmark that the state has set in terms of I-STEP outcomes, we have shown exponential amount of growth in ELA and math.
What about proficiency? That's the other half of the formula, right?
It
So
is.
how are you doing in proficiency?
We are moving in the right direction for proficiency. I do not have the data in front of me to be able to quote you percentage rates in terms of proficiency, but in looking at the growth and aligning it with the proficiency, there was positive outcomes.
But it's not just the letter
Madam
grade
Chair.
that's part of that, correct?
Yes, sir.
I just want to state that it's very possible that students can experience academic improvement from year to year that's not reflected in the standardized testing. So for us to just lock in and say the accountability grade is going to be the sole determinative of whether or not there was academic improvement, I think is just wrong. And they probably know their students better than we do, but obviously we have to have some objective measure to put to it. But if they're saying from their some assessments that they're giving that their growth measure has improved, that's academic improvement.
Are you using other kinds of academic proficiency instruments?
Yes, we are this year. We're using Acuity Predictive, and we do it 3 times out of the year. We have seen growth in the students with using Acuity
Have you
Predictive
seen
as well.
proficiency levels higher? I guess
We
I'm
have
getting
seen
away
some
from, I'm
proficiency
assuming.
levels higher. We have seen some proficiency levels higher.
Okay.
However, coming in and transforming a school and training the teachers, we know that there are some fundamental pieces that obviously were absent, some systemic structures that were not there when I arrived. And by implementing those structures, by training the teachers, I'm confident in being able to match the growth and the proficiency at the end of the year. And I won't say at the end of this school year because it takes time. I am trusting and faithful for greater outcomes this year, but I know if given another year that we definitely will meet the benchmarks that the state has set, especially relative to rigor.
So you might have some evidence there of that. All I'm getting at is I'm trying to support my
Yes,
colleague.
sir.
There may be some other indicators that would meet it.
I have a follow-up, one to Tim and then another one to Dr. Bertram and Tony. So relative to the law, just to make sure that I understand, we're spending our time understanding what how are we going to define academic improvement? Right. And so as we are forging a path, as we will see these time and time again, what I'm hearing is the staff is recommending a bright line rule of using the grades because that's objective and consistent. And we are wanting to apply a totality of the circumstances case by case analysis, which I understand, but I just want to make sure we collectively see that I am requesting that we articulate the basis on which we're relying for suggesting that we approve the appeal for another year and how we're defining academic improvement in this instance so that we can hold each other accountable moving forward for what those standards are. And I am not clear on that. So I would like to understand, it's an important decision that we're making right now, what standard of review we're going to hold ourselves to. And I don't know that we all really have our arms around what we're talking about here. And so I think we need to step back and articulate that and come to consensus on that so that we have clarity around why we did what we did today.
I think Ms. Milk did an excellent job of articulating the issue with these types of appeals or requests because we have had to try to create a bright line indicator to follow because the statute is not clear. So I think that really layer with those words that I want to make sure that everybody understands what the indicator or what the reason for granting the appeal is.
Yes. Are there any academic indicators in which the school has shown improvement? Any?
I'm not sure if I can answer
It's
that
in the
beyond
memo.
the proficiency
I know,
rating.
I'm just asking a question. I mean, you know, and if so, I mean, if all we have to do is go by letter grades, we don't need an appeal process. We have the letter grades. If there are no exceptions, no waivers, then, I mean, that's what we have the responsibility to do, is to look at all academic indicators. That's the waiver process, correct?
I don't think that's true, Vince, because if their letter grade were higher, then we would have demonstrable evidence based on the letter grade being improved as opposed to, in this instance, a D and a D.
To answer your question, I'm not aware of any other indicators, but that's based on in the situation, my reliance on looking at the letter grade based off of previous action by the board.
So the decision was made strictly on the letter grade.
But, I mean, one thing we need to keep in mind is you can have improvement within the letter grade. So you could be a low D and now you're a high D. So I don't think, unless we're going to actually break out the raw data every time and say, okay, and compare it to the raw data of the previous year, there can be improvement within the letter grade. So that's why just going on the letter grade, I think is a little problematic for me personally. I do want to hear the school articulate what other indicators they have to show that there's academic improvement. But by and large, I just, in my gut, feel it's the right thing to do. I don't know how to articulate that as a standard.
What is the, I'm sorry, BJ, what is there a remedy other than making a decision today to get more information? Because I think there's something inside of what you just said about why can't we get the raw data and make a decision? If there is movement within a grade, that's a bright line that's tied to case by case analysis and movement. I mean, we have to have some information other than, I'm not comfortable with gut feeling because that's not equitable and consistent.
Well, that's why I wanted her to answer the question about what other indicators they have. But I don't think it should be just based on the standardized testing, so I'm against that in general.
So the other indicator that we have is, as I spoke, the acuity predictive information. That is what we use locally within the schools. Relative to that, when we speak in terms of academic indicators, we can only talk about how the students are, and it would be formative assessment. We can only speak to how the students are engaged in classroom instruction, what it is that we're able to see come out in the acuity predictive, how that information is used to inform instruction beyond there, and the growth that occurs relative to that. So if we were bringing raw data or any data that would speak to academic indicators beyond ISTEP, it would be limited to acuity predictive.
But I'm sure you would have attendance and you would have discipline records
Oh,
and
we
you would
most
have all of
definitely
that.
have attendance, discipline records,
Beyond,
absolutely,
yeah.
absolutely. But when we were talking about academic
Right.
indicators,
But
is
there
why
are
I
a
didn't
lot of
speak to other
indicators,
buckets.
as everybody talked about, that surround improvement
Correct.
beyond.
Absolutely.
What impact would it have on you if we waited? Because I'm in complete agreement with Tony's, there can be movement within a grade, absolutely. But I also agree completely with Katie that we're really setting the stage here for what this is going to look like in the future, and that's a scary thing to me.
Okay.
Does it impact you greatly if we hold this for 30 days and you, on the spot, we can ask you to give that to us right now. If you can, you're more amazing than I think you are already. But could you bring us that data showing those improvement? Because improvement looks a lot of different ways.
It does.
And to Vince's point, it can be unique, but I still think that we need to see it and have our hands on it. in
Yes,
order
we
to make
could
a
submit some
decision
additional data.
as we move forward. Your case alone is fine, but when we start building this,
The precedence, yes.
it's a scary thing to move forward without that. And I want to break it out. I want to see that stuff.
Did you appeal your, just out of curiosity, you didn't appeal your letter grade this year, did you?
Yes, we did appeal the letter grade because we actually thought that was the way to go through the appeal, was going through the letter grade, but we did go that process first, and they said that the letter grade was accurate, and then we went this step to go one step further.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Gordon?
It seems to me like what I'm hearing is commentary from fellow board members that would ask for the board to adopt a policy which would provide further guidance to schools that might be considering appeals. Right now, we have the criteria that, what the law says, obviously, and that there's a lot of flexibility in that, it seems. What does improvement mean? So, from my vantage point, it may serve us to detail that from a board perspective, and we wouldn't be creating a law or anything like that, but we could approve as a board a policy that I think would provide maybe more guidance to schools about what our criteria is for moving forward. It would flesh out some of the discussion that we have every month or two about what constitutes improvement. It seems like we've had a lot of that. From my vantage point, to give you my position on this, and first off, I want to tip my hat to my fellow state board former colleague, Senator Melton, who's moved on to bigger things, and we're happy to have you here and wish you well. From my vantage point, I have real concerns about approving this because, and that's not to say there hasn't been really solid improvement, et cetera. I've read the memo, I acknowledge that. But I also believe that we need to hold schools to a higher standard here that are under the scholarships. And the law has set up a criteria. And, to be consistent with my prior positions, I feel like you do need the data. And I recognize that there can be movement within a letter grade. But at the same time, from my vantage point, the state legislature and the law set out a pretty clear, criteria for us. And just looking at what the data we have before us, I have concerns that, again, a no vote against a waiver does not mean we're closing down the school. It just means we're asking for further improvement in the school's performance based on the criteria that we have before us. So, again, I'm supportive of what you all are trying to do. I want you to know that, and want to see further success, but I have concerns about waiving what we have set out in law, and that's just my, I think, somewhat conservative viewpoint about how we should use our state dollars in our schools. But I understand the arguments on the other side. I appreciate it. I've said before, sometimes these are close calls, but that's kind of where I come down.
May I ask a question?
Yes, sorry.
When you were saying that the law was pretty clear in what it was asking, were we talking about being clear in terms of consequences, or just being clear when you speak about academic achievement? Because it is lacking in specificity when you speak about
Improvement.
what. Okay. Okay.
Dr. Yeager, did you have a comment?
Just a question, Tim. You probably need to respond. I was a little confused, Gordon, when you mentioned us setting a policy that would override state statute.
No. It wouldn't override. The intent would be to provide guidance to schools that may be considering a waiver as to what our standards are as a board. It doesn't mean every individual member needs to agree with it, but to me, it would be helpful for the board to provide some detailed guidance as to what, if it's going to be based straight up on letter grades, then that's the policy. Or it could include other things that are maybe include other data points or other things that schools are doing to improve performance. But to me, it would be providing further detail about what that means. Then we can all debate that policy and determine what makes the most sense from a do we grant or do we not grant a waiver in a particular situation. Because right now, who knows? The exception, you could drive a truck through it. There just isn't as much clarity because it's based on very undefined language. And I would like to provide, I think would be helpful to not just this board, but to schools out there who are where this law might be applicable, to receive guidance, detailed definition, as to what, how this board, and also it helps set that precedent as well. So it just provides guidance to those schools. So hopefully that wasn't too
You're saying guidance to the schools and not guidance to the board?
Well, both. It would be, we could refer to our policy and say, this is what we have agreed to. And of course, 5 years from now, we could change that policy. But I just feel that otherwise, every time we hear a choice scholarship waiver, we're going to be having the same argument about, well, what constitutes improvement or not. And, we forgot what we said 6 months ago.
So we have a motion on the floor to
Hold
approve.
on. I had one more question. I'd ask Tim to come up.
Yes, Tim.
So the statute again says,
Quoting from Section B of the statute. If the eligible school demonstrates that a majority of students in the eligible school demonstrated academic improvement during the preceding school year, end quote, and the board may grant the waiver. And it does say may. It's not mandatory.
BJ has one final comment.
Waive or delay consequences.
Can we give you the option, because can we give you the option to bring this back in 30 days, because I can tell you it will impact my vote. I can't speak for anyone else on this board, but I'm telling you, bringing data back, showing growth will get my support, and right now, that's not there.
Okay.
And again, I'm one person, but I feel like we owe, since we're kind of building the plane in the air here, I feel like we owe you the courtesy to bring those growth tables back to us next month. Does that impact?
It definitely impacts the school and me. However, my statement to that end question, I guess, would be in bringing that data back, while it will definitely provide something concrete for you, is it what would shift everyone else on the board's mind, give or take where it is that they currently stand?
I think just a request for data, something that we can stand on is what we need.
I don't have a problem supplying it.
So we have a motion on the floor to approve the waiver, correct?
Correct.
And there's a second. Roll call, please.
Dr. Burke,
Yes.
Dr. Ernest,
Yes. Oh, yes.
Dr.
If I
Freitas.
if I could interject just on a matter of procedure, Chairwoman.
So board, in the middle of a vote, I need some guidance on this for parliamentary procedure. Tim, are you the expert? We're in the middle of a vote.
Once a vote has begun, typically there would not be further discussion, but as the chair, I would defer to your choice.
If we vote no, can we vote no and give her the option to come back in 30 days?
Yes.
Yeah.
That's
We're
actually what happened
certain,
last year.
we're certain that we can say come back in 30 days if the
Another
vote is no.
alternative, and again, we're not really in a great position as far as procedure. You could offer a motion to postpone the vote until
That was my intent.
March. But we're in the middle of roll call, so we are at the moment astray of Robert's rules. If you want the answer.
Just for clarification.
So in the middle of a vote, we need to finish the vote is what you're telling me.
That would be my recommendation.
Okay, so who are we on? I'm sorry.
Dr. Freitas,
No.
Mr. Henry,
No.
Ms. Moe,
No.
Mr. Walker,
Yes.
Mr. Watts,
No.
Ms. Swicker,
No.
Dr. Yeager.
No.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So can we make a motion at this point to give you
believe
the
so.
opportunity to return in 30 days with the data to support this waiver?
Do we have a second?
Second.
Can I just comment on the motion?
Okay, so Tim, here's the question that they're going to ask. Can we do this?
Can
You restate it?
Yeah, please.
Make a motion to come back in 30 days with data to support your academic achievement.
I hope the
Or
answer to that,
improvements
yes,
you've
that's the
made.
question I
Hang
asked
on.
before I voted.
I guess the motion is appropriate. I don't know if it's necessary, as all that just happened right now is that your motion to approve the waiver did not receive sufficient yes votes to pass.
So they can come back with another request at the next meeting.
Yes.
And we
With
would
more
just have an
data.
opportunity to, so we don't need a motion or any action on it. Okay, come back in 30 days.
I'll
have a
see you in
question.
30 days. Am I submitting the data prior to, or am I bringing the data in with?
Thank you.
And
I have a
just
question.
In case anybody's concerned, that is how we actually handled this last year. We did have people come back.
We
with-
did?
Yes.
Okay, Dr.
Did
Freitas.
have people come back?
Yeah, because the initial motions did not receive an approval. Based discussion much like this, where the board members asked for clarification of the law and the data, and then the waivers were resubmitted.
So
Is there a
Dr.
difference between?
Dr. Freitas had a question. Hang on, Gordon.
Yeah, I'm okay with her coming back. I think everyone deserves as many opportunities as possible. My question is, shouldn't we do what Katie has recommended and a few other people? Shouldn't we as a board decide what the criteria are in advance? Because we're going to have to do that anyway. Why not do that prior to her coming back so she knows what to look for, and then come back to the board saying, these are your criteria, here's how I meet them, versus her coming back in 30 days and we have this discussion again, and we frankly don't have our act together with this. I think we need to get our act together, set the criteria, whatever it is. If it's letter grades only, is that how people vote? Then that's it. If it's other kinds of things, I think we need to agree to that up front so we don't get into this position. The legislature passes bills giving us a lot of authority. They use language that has ambiguity, and I appreciate that because then it gives us the decision-making process to set those guardrails, to set those standards. And frankly, I don't think the legislature should be getting into that detail. But they rely on us to set that detail. And so we haven't done that work yet. And I think we need to get our work done prior to anyone else coming back.
So Dr. Freitas, what I'm hearing you request of the state board staff is to work on some proposed language?
Yeah, I mean, someone, whether it's board staff or DOE or in collaboration.
Sure. So board staff, if you could work on that, that would be great.
We did. Do we all agree on that?
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Freitas is an individual.
I'm making it as a suggestion. I'm not demanding.
I think we ought to, I think this is much too important to just defer to board staff. You know, no offense. You know,
I'll be honest. I'll be honest because we'll get more of these. Having some sort of guidance from the board members would make my job a lot easier.
And you know, board staff is just going to come to us with a menu of, you know, arranged from A to Z. So, and we're going to have to debate it anyway. My view is this is an appropriate time for an ad hoc or a subcommittee or something where a few board members can work on it. And, you know, it's not going to take 30 days. It's going to take 4 to 6 months. And then bring back some recommendations to the board for discussion, debate, and potentially setting a policy. That's just my opinion. You know, I think it's best done in committee as opposed to everyone on here going through a menu of ideas or concepts. It's just going to get out of hand.
PJ?
I think to the point earlier where I land with this is every situation is unique. That's why you bring it here. And I don't know that I necessarily want guidelines and want criteria because I think it's our job to evaluate all of these on a case-by-case basis. I think we need to be consistent in how we apply it, but the criteria I don't think that we need to set. So that's where I would fall with it.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think we want a second accountability rule.
Agreed.
I mean, we have a state accountability rule, right, that's been established, and the General Assembly has given us broad authority to consider individual cases. If we just create another set of regulations, then essentially there's no waiver process, right? I mean, it's just come and do you meet these, and then the answer is yes. If we can't take individual circumstance into consideration, then we're abdicating our responsibility as a board. I think that is part of our responsibility, is to look at situations, and they differ based on different communities, different places, different schools. The question really is the school able to show academic improvement? It doesn't say what. If the legislature intended for us to answer that question for every school, it would be in statute. But they didn't intend for it. They gave us the opportunity for a waiver. And I think that's our responsibility to consider each case on a case-by-case basis.
And by that same token, the legislature could have wrote into the statute that if they don't demonstrate an improvement in their school letter grade. They didn't do that.
And that's
Tim, go ahead.
They said academic improvement.
Go ahead, Tim.
So based off of comments I've heard today from board members, one thing we could certainly incorporate into these memos going forward would be showing growth data and proficiency data broken down by the 2 years, because it has to be from the preceding year. And we could also provide the actual grade percentage, because that was something, you know, a high D versus a low D. That's what I'm hearing is something that could potentially be helpful in addition to other factors that a school might think are relevant. I don't know if that's, am I hearing that right?
Their acuity data would be important to me, or I mean, whatever, I mean, acuity is what they use, any of those things. I think we leave it up to the school because, again, I'm going to support you when you come back in 30 days. I just want that data for us to build the case for. I support what you're doing and know that there's growth there. So when you come back, my vote will change. I just want to see that and have it in my hands. That's why I voted no.
Gordon.
I I hear what you're saying, but I just think it's, way too loosey-goosey. And we need to, in my view, establish some real criteria so that we can decide what's important and what's not. Otherwise, it's going to be, every meeting is going to be, well, it's this factor, this factor, this factor. And I realize that gives us a heck of a lot of flexibility, but in my view, there should be a little bit more substance to it. Or maybe guidance is the better word. Guidance to, everyone out there. But, to me, there's not going to be any real consistency. Despite our best intentions, there won't be that consistency year to year. And when board members change out of here, 3 new board members bring 3 different attitudes, and then all of a sudden we've got a different criteria or different standards. So my view is that the best course is to actually roll up our sleeves and figure out what it is we think improvement is. And there might be disagreement on that. But to me, we ought to try to figure out and better define what that actually means to this board so that we can provide guidance to every Hoosier.
I just have a clarification of fact. So your students, are you K-8 only? You do not have a high school?
We do not have a high school. It's a pre-K.
Okay. Thank you.
I want to thank
Thank
you
you.
for being here and your patience and the group here that has traveled with you. I appreciate the patience of all of you, and I understand what you're saying, Mr. Henry, but I also feel like we already have that guidance, and it's there. So I think the what's written is written, and we follow it. That's just last comment for the day.
Thank you very much. Okay, election of secretary.
Madam, I would recommend that Dr. Ernest be appointed as secretary or voted in as secretary for the board.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Discussion? Dr. Ernest, are you good with that? Hey now.
That'd be wonderful. How is it?
Resume builder. Okay, roll call, please.
Enthusiastically, yes.
Enthusiastically, yes.
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 Yes. Gary Schools and Corporation Grade. Oh, congratulations, Dr. Ernest.
Thank you.
Gary Schools and Corporation Grade Placements. Dr. Flores is back.
Maggie will come up momentarily to share a memo with you for approval, but again, I wanted to take the opportunity to provide some context about that memo that she will bring. As you remember, in the fall, the department brought forward response analysis information. We receive this annually from Pearson as a way to understand test administration procedures taking place in the field. The department completed the follow-up that was requested related to the response analysis. Schools were placed into 2 tiers based on the standard deviations associated with response changes. 41 flag sessions were identified in the data we received from Pearson. 30 of those were in tier 1, which is 4 to 6 standard deviations away from the mean. 11 sessions were placed in tier 2, which was over 6 standard deviations from the mean. As a reminder, the majority of flag sessions were at a single grade level or content area in a single school within a corporation. Based on our review of all of the forms that were submitted from corporations, there was insufficient evidence to substantiate whether a test administration or test security violation occurred for any school based on that documentation, except for one, which is McCullough. So I'm going to walk through that specific school's results with you this afternoon. So again, as a reminder, McCullough was flagged for 8 sessions, 2 in English language arts and 6 in mathematics. They exceeded the state average for wrong to right answer changes. Typically, we would see as the average less than 1 answer change. The department completed a thorough review of this information for McCullough. We completed 9 interviews with staff to further elicit feedback on the response analysis data. These interviews did not provide evidence of staff following the prescribed protocols, which led to additional review by the department. This additional review considered data that we exported from Pearson's system, and based on systematic patterns of irregularities, we extended our review of the data to include all sessions in grades 3 through 8, math, ELA, science, and social studies. The outcomes for our review, we have 2. First, McCullough staff did not develop or use a formal test schedule. Secondly, McCullough staff deviated from prescribed test administration procedures. Again, through this review, we found systematic patterns of irregularities, which, considering the totality of circumstances, led us to significant concerns with the test administration practices. Regarding the test schedule, we received a document which was vague in nature that indicated which grade levels might have had access to the computer lab on a given day, but examiners were unable to provide any documentation regarding when specific students were tested, how or why those students were grouped, and how the sections of the test were ultimately scheduled for the test administration. I'll highlight a couple of examples on the next 4 slides for you here. Again, these are examples, and we have additional examples that are evident through our review. First, all 13 test sessions reviewed by the department contained 1 or more students without IEPs or 504s with test sections that exceeded the maximum allowed time. One example of this is noted here. Again, a student test was accessed at approximately 2:31, exited at 3:10, the elapsed time 39 minutes. That test section should have been completed in 22. The next slide indicates an example of McCullough's grouping of students. McCullough students were grouped into smaller groups within classes and tested at widely varying times for our content area. This contributed to our concern regarding security and the administration of the assessment. Again, with the grouping of these students, there are some of these groups that had a much higher number of response changes, and additionally, those students were tested on different days than the preceding section. The third point I'd like to emphasize is that a majority of McCullough's test sessions were completed in a single day. That is not the standard guidance that we provide at the department, essentially trying to manage both the formal test time that's allocated for the administration, but also test fatigue. And again, I will note here that while students were tested in a single day, one particular student, it was not that their entire test session, their group, was tested in that same day. And lastly, the fourth point I'd like to highlight is that in grades 3 through 8, 10 of the 13 test sessions reviewed had one or more students whose test sessions were re-entered on a later day, even though these sessions had either previously been completed or had some questions answered. So again, in this particular example, the test was entered on April 19th with responses indicated. On a subsequent day, and in some of these examples on a much later day, that test was re-entered with the student login again. And in those examples, we had a significant amount of test time that goes over what we would expect to see. So as a result of that, we are recommending the following actions. Again, we are considering the totality of all of these circumstances, really concerned about the test administration practices that were underway in this site. First, we will invalidate all test sections for the school for the spring 2017 assessment. We are also working very closely with Gary's leadership to ensure that the Part 1 ISTEP administration, which begins on February 26th, is managed very carefully. So we have defined actions that Gary's leadership must take, and we are working closely with them on a daily basis to manage those next steps. The department will conduct additional on-site monitoring of McCullough throughout the test administration that's coming up. And the department will review additional actions regarding McCullough staff that were responsible for overseeing the test administration. So I'll see if there's questions. Otherwise, I'll hand it over to Maggie. Dr. Yeager?
Dr. Flores, who all from DOE was involved in this effort?
So there are aspects of this that the assessment team managed, particularly with the data analysis. We also have worked very closely with Marcia's team, knowing some of the challenges and next steps that we may need to consider.
And that was a group of how many people?
On my team, there have been primarily 3 individuals that have been dedicated to this review.
I want to take the opportunity to say thank you for your work. This is not easy, I know. But your work and the work of the staff and your staff and you as leader, I certainly appreciate what you've done. And the consequences, I think, are appropriate. The other statement I would make is, knowing that Dr. Hinckley is more or less in charge up there in Gary right now, I'm guessing that these will be followed and more. And I have no reservations to think that Dr. Hinckley's staff would not move forward with this. I appreciate your work.
Feedback. Thank you.
Maggie? Thank you, Charity.
So based on the findings from the department's investigation of the issue and the test administration irregularities, we didn't have any valid data for McCullough that's part of Gary Community Schools. Therefore, we were not able to calculate an accountability grade for the 16-17 school year. I believe there is a memo that outlines the letter grades for all of the Gary Community Schools, including McCullough, as well as the corporation grade. And the department is requesting the board officially place the schools within the Gary Community School Corporation in those 16-17 categories.
Do we have a motion to accept the recommendation?
So moved.
Any other discussion? Roll call, please.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Mr. Walker?
Yes.
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 Thank you.
Discussion and reports, assessment update.
I just have a few brief slides in terms of an update for you today. First, just to note that we do have 2 windows that are currently underway. The WIDA assessment window is open through next Friday, and iStar Part 1 is currently underway and closes on Friday. We have not had any significant concerns identified from the field at this point from either of those open test windows. The second update that I have for you today is iStep Part 1, as I indicated a few moments ago, will open on February 26th. As a reminder, this will be for grades 3 through 8 and 10. In grade 10, it will be for those students that need it as a first-time administration for their requirement and also as a retest opportunity. The other update that I wanted to make is specific to the online participation. Several months ago, I did indicate to the board that we are promoting the thoughtful transition to online, especially given iLearn for 1819. So I did just want to inform the board of the associated percentages per grade, how many of those corporations have moved online. So if you just look as an example, we have 35% online for grade 3. Once we get to grade 8 and grade 10, it's a very significant number, 87% at grade 8 and 96% at grade 10. And those are my only updates for today.
Any questions, Dr. Flores? Thank you. Accountability rule timeline.
Good afternoon. I wanted to provide the board with a quick update in regards to the accountability rule and how we're progressing with that. As of this morning, the notice of a public hearing was published in the Indianapolis Star, and we're anticipating that the text of the proposed rule, as well as the notice of public hearing, will be published in the Indiana Register. With that, your board materials contained a memo that I put together that had a suggested timeline for the rulemaking process going forward. It includes today's meeting all the way through the end of the process. So what we anticipate happening is that the board will take a final vote on a final version of the rule at the April 4th board meeting. In order to accommodate you all, and so you have enough time to consider public comment, we've gone ahead and we've arranged for 5 separate public hearings in different parts of the state. As part of that, we have coordinated with court reporters who will be providing transcripts of every single public comment. That way, the board can have the public comments sooner rather than later. And in addition to that, we're at least recommending that the board consider adding 2 additional meetings to your calendar, March 21st and April 3rd, as working sessions to consider the public comments that we collect at those hearings, and as well as to give the board an opportunity to incorporate changes to the proposed rule based on the public comments you've heard. So with that, I'm happy to take any questions about the timeline. And I will say that the timeline, not only is it provided in the memo, but the dates of the public hearings have all been updated on the board's website. And again, the March 9th meeting has been published in the Register in Indianapolis Star.
Chad, the March 21st and the April 3rd, those are work sessions. Is that what you just said? Did I hear that right?
Yeah, I mean, that's how they've been recommended as work sessions for the board to consider, the public comment that we receive.
Like just for planning purposes all day?
So, I'm going to leave this to your discretion. Again, these were recommended dates based on the board's past practice of preferring Wednesdays, since that's the day that we have board meetings. And then April 3rd is simply the Tuesday before the April 4th meeting. And I know in the past that the board has preferred to have work sessions the day before a meeting if possible.
I know when I reached out to Brian just for clarification for calendar purposes,
Yeah.
I think he said a couple hours. Correct me if I'm wrong, Matt. I don't think it was an all day, but I could be wrong. For the workshops, or the work session, sorry. Like 2 or 3 hours?
I think that's what
Just so you
we
all-
anticipated, but if the board needs more time, that's certainly up to your schedule.
Gordon?
Just comment on the timeline. I personally, and this is consistent with prior comments, prior meetings, I personally would like one additional, the 2 work sessions. I personally think that we ought to consider and debate April 4th, and then final vote would be at our May meeting. That would just be my recommendation. Just give us a little bit extra time for full consideration.
Say that again, Gordon, I'm sorry.
I would suggest that we consider instead of April 4th SBO meeting, vote to approve or not approve, I would just say board discussion. And then final vote, then vote set for our May meeting.
So timeline-wise, does that work?
Well, so that's certainly up to the board's discretion, but I feel like I should make you aware that that April 4th deadline for a board vote is the deadline that will be required if you intend to have a rule fully promulgated for the following school year. So that is kind of the drop dead date the board's working with. Not to say that you can't go to the May meeting, but if you do go to the May meeting, that will delay the effective date of the rule.
So it wouldn't be in effect for the next school year?
It would not be in effect for the 18-19 school year.
So if we stick to the April 4th to make sure that gets in, the option would be to move one of the work sessions, correct? So we would have more time. Is that what you're saying, Gordon? You want more time between the work session and the actual vote? Because if that April 4th is the magic date for next school year, that we have to pay attention to that.
The April 4th is kind of the locked-in date. Now, the other dates, as far as the March 21st and the April 3rd date, I mean, the board is certainly welcome to add a third date or change those dates, whatever you feel comfortable.
Chad, is the April 4th, to your point, is April 4th the last day, or that's the last day because that's the day the meeting's on? You'll see where I'm going with this.
Yeah,
so second meeting in April.
So that I know where you're going with that. So that is, or not only is that the last day because it's a board meeting, but that would give us time, staff time to prepare between the 4th and the 6th, which is a Friday, all the materials that's required for submission.
Okay, so the 6th, that was my question.
Yeah.
I didn't maybe ask that question.
Real
right.
deadline's
The 6th is the real deadline.
Yes, but staff will need time to put together
I
the
got
final
you.
documentation for
I've
delivery to the
got
Attorney
you.
General.
If it was going to be like the 18th, I'm thinking, well, we just call it, or we have a meeting to just, you know what I'm saying?
Secretary extraordinaire.
Yes, exactly.
I was trying to help my fellow board member walk through that. I'll shut up.
You know, and one assumption that we've made here is that the Attorney General's office will use the entire statutory amount of time allotted to it to review the documents. The flip side of that is, fingers crossed, that the governor's office will not. So we've tried to build in.
So if we vote at 7 a.m. on the 6th, can you have it done by that?
I will do everything in my power to make sure that it is submitted to the Attorney General. Yes. See you there.
Hey, I've sat through all these other discussions.
But yeah, so.
So maybe we can work on that with the state board staff and
Yeah,
do some
we're happy
behind the
to
scene
accommodate the board
conversations.
schedule
And
on those recommended work
we'll
orders.
look at some dates. We'll review that.
All right, and then finally, the public comment period. We have been receiving public comments, but now that the rule is published, it's officially open. The website has the information required if people would like to submit public comment by email. But again, at the public hearings, there will be a court reporter taking a transcript, so people are certainly welcome to attend those public hearings and make their comment in person. So, thank you.
Thank you.
Just couple
Dr. Yeager?
comments. Thank you. I want to thank the state board staff for bouncing around the state. I think originally there wasn't much interest in moving outside of the Indianapolis area. I asked them to consider that, and boy, did you respond. So there are 4, one in each corner of the state. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
And I appreciate the fact that we'll have official minutes. We don't have to live stream those.
So we are not required to live stream them. I think that there are some statutory provisions that say that the meetings are open to the public, so somebody could.
Okay.
The meeting or something, but
All right.
it is not a public meeting like this is a public meeting.
Sure, but I just appreciate the fact that we're moving around and there are enough dates to have board members that, if we're able to get to those meetings and participate and listen. The other thing I would ask is, you're going to get a lot of feedback because you're bouncing around the state. Could I ask the staff to put together a compilation of each meeting? If you can categorize some of the thoughts, ideas, and concerns into divisions so that we could hear how many people who testified or sent emails regarding each meeting, what the compilation of those thoughts and ideas support or reconsideration efforts from the public could be put together in some sort of a spreadsheet that all of us could receive. So if we can't make a meeting, we'll at least know. If people can't make the Fort Wayne Ivy Tech campus meeting on Monday, they'll at least get a feedback on what the thoughts and ideas were from the presenters.
Yeah, so
Not the presenters, but those people who testified.
yeah, so everybody will receive all comments made, but if I'm understanding you correctly, in addition to having every comment available, you would like that further subdivided comments, not only by the type of comment that's being made, but also the region where it came from or the particular meeting that it was.
Like after, a day or two after the meeting, in addition to getting the spread, just a copy of the notes of the meeting, it would be nice to, along with that, get a spreadsheet of the meeting and just say, this covered the Fort Wayne meeting. These were the top 6 topics, and 8 people spoke on this, and 14 people spoke on this.
And if I may, that was already our intent. I believe Ryan used the term at the last meeting of matrix. So when we have a big rule like this, we get a lot of public comment. We will. It's been our practice to do exactly what you're asking for. I think the last time we did it was great. So it's been a while.
Okay.
You will get that.
Well, maybe dig that spreadsheet out and we'll reuse it. But I'd also like to ask further if we have Monday's meeting and that summary, the spreadsheet that Mrs. Wicker is talking about, and then Thursday's meeting is in South Bend. So if we could have South Bend's independent, but also compile Fort Wayne and South Bend comments, and then do the same thing with Evansville. Let's get Evansville's thoughts, and then compile all 3 meetings, and then the 4th meeting in Madison, if we could get and do the same concept, and then the 5th meeting being in downtown, so that by the end of all these meetings, we'll know what each region thought as well as what all the regions thought. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. We'll certainly work to provide that.
Okay, and if we can get that, I don't want to put it, because I know things happen and life gets in the way professionally and personally, but if we can get that to us as soon as possible, within 2 or 3 days, would be very nice.
Yes, we will try our best on that.
Sounds like you have a delegated assignment.
Wow, Tim, what a team player.
But thank you, again, thanks to the staff for bouncing around the state. I know that's not the easiest thing in the world to do, but we do appreciate you moving around and accommodating the public.
Yes, and so it sounds like you intend to attend some of these meetings. I think staff, we would ask that if board members are going to attend these meetings, you at least let staff know. That way, if we hit a quorum number for any particular meeting, we can at least provide notice.
Quorum's not an issue, is it? As long as we don't take a vote and make any decisions?
Yeah, I think, but just to be sure, we'd like to be able to.
Notice is a board meeting.
Yes, because at that point, I think you'll be receiving official information, which is a board action. So it's not an issue as long as we know. But
Okay, I'll tell you right now, I'm making every meeting except South Bend.
all right.
Okay.
Put you on.
Thank you. Technical Advisory Committee reports.
So we need to get a TAC member on the phone. May I recommend that we take a short break and we'll get that lined up and then.
Short break, 5 minutes. Thank you.
Perfect.
1:25, we'll be back.
Who told you that it was at the Coliseum campus?
Well,
Okay.
they did.
Okay. Okay.
But they changed it.
Okay. Okay, 'cause I want to finish
Yeah. Hey, I sure did.
She said we can go if you want.
You have every right.
Yeah, I say we roll. I say we roll. Okay. Okay, we can. We're going to start. We're going to get rolling. I have a long drive.
Wait till he leaves.
You want Katie to swing her mic down? Please, and thank you. But please don't.
Hurry up, please. We're a little chippy now, aren't we?
Oh, I like it. Chad, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Okay.
So let's go ahead and get started with the TAC update discussion item. This update pertains to the board's technical advisory committee's review of the Indiana core tests. Just a very brief background, then I'll turn it over to Dr. Buckendahl, who's a member of our TAC. Back early last year, a number of individuals came before the board and expressed concerns regarding the core assessments and asked that the board review. The board then tasked the staff to work with the technical advisory committee to review various information. And today, Dr. Buckendahl is kind enough to provide us with an update. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Buckendahl.
Thanks, Tim. Hi, everyone. Chad Buckendahl. As Tim mentioned, I am a member of the TAC, and my background is as a psychometrician, working about half of my time within the education space in kind of the K-12 arena, and then the other half of my time I spend working in licensure and certification testing. And so I don't know if I drew the short straw or Tim actually wanted me to represent the TAC for this update, but my background in credentialing kind of relates closely to the purpose of the core assessment program. And so the core assessment program is designed as a teacher certification program, and though it's certification, if it's mandatory for practice, it's actually kind of considered then a de facto licensure examination. So the purpose of the licensure examination is to distinguish people who are minimally competent and would likely not do harm to the public from those who aren't. And so it's kind of with that lens, the TAC was asked to take a look at the core assessment program. And in terms of the timeline of events, essentially what the TAC is looking for in this review is the program itself contains a number of tests. I believe there's more than 60 tests actually in the program. Each of these tests has to be able to stand on its own in terms of the evidence to support the decisions made about individual candidates who are taking the examinations. And so what we're looking for in terms of evidence is usually can be summarized in kind of four sources. We're looking at information about validity with respect largely to the content specification and how the content of the examinations relate to the actual job being performed that the credential is related to. The second element that we're looking at is usually reliability of the scores, reliability of the scorers if there are human scored aspects to the assessment, and then reliability ultimately of the decisions, of these pass-fail decisions that are made from the exams. The third major component that we were looking at is going to be information about fairness, and particularly from a legal standpoint, we look at that both in terms of substantive elements and then also procedural aspects to make sure that everybody's kind of getting the same opportunity. And then finally, we looked at standard setting, and this standard setting is the process by which you're actually establishing the passing score for the examination. So those are kind of the four kind of larger categories of information that the TAC was looking at. In terms of the actual process, as Tim mentioned, we started looking at the evidence for the program earlier in 2017. I think at our April 2017 meeting, we started looking at some of the information. Over the course of the past 10 months or so, we have we've asked for additional information. We've reviewed materials and asked the vendor evaluation systems to provide additional information at a couple different points in time over these past number of months, and have written up a couple of kind of memos asking for things specifically in a few cases, and then just for kind of additional follow-up information, ultimately culminating with a conclusion from the TAC that we believe that there is sufficient information to support continued use of the assessments. At the same time, we have identified what we believe to be opportunities for the program to kind of continually improve, and in doing so, I've identified a few sources of evidence that we believe that the program can, both in the short and long term, kind of add to the evidence to kind of strengthen ultimately strengthen the claims about the program. So, in a very quick nutshell, that's kind of what we've been doing over the past few months, and I think my goal is really to hopefully respond to any questions that the board might have about the our evaluation process or any of the information that's been provided about our review.
Does anyone have any questions?
I do.
Dr. Freitas? Dr. Ernest?
I was looking over there, I'm like, man, if he's there, something's wrong.
I'm so used to calling on him for questions.
Okay. Sorry, Dr. Buckendall. That the context really doesn't mean anything to you when you're on the phone, right? But we are having a little fun here.
That's good.
Byron coming at you here with a question. So a year ago, January, we had individuals come before us with concerns, and we listened to them. We said they're, all the things that you've talked about, right? So my question is I'd like for it to be a simple yes or no answer, but then maybe give a little bit with that once you do that. If you were one of those prospective teachers who had gone through a program, taken this exam, could not get past it, we've heard we heard testimony a couple of weeks ago of 10 times to take this. If you were one of those individuals, knowing what you know, and what you've studied with this, would you question the validity of this test to be the determiner of you being able to take a job?
So yeah, you've asked a question that mixes a few concepts. So to give you a simple yes or no, I'm sure that if I were a failing candidate who didn't understand test development and validation, then yes, I would question it, because, I would think if I went through a training program, then that training program should have adequately prepared me to pass a test that's designed to measure minimum competency. However, because my background is in testing, the thing that for these sorts of programs it's tough for people to understand is that if the training program has not aligned its curriculum and instruction directly to the expectations of the actual assessment, then the probability of success declines rapidly. And the difficult thing, I think, for people who are maybe in education in particular to understand is a licensure test is not designed to be an indicator of a program's curriculum and instruction. It's simply designed to be an indicator of whether or not the practice, the actual what's occurring in practice, that somebody has those skills to be able to kind of enter at an entry level, really truly at an entry level. And the test itself is actually not designed to be a measure of any one program's curriculum and instruction. And that's the case whether we're talking about nursing, law, architecture, any of the other kind of professional licensure programs out there. But I will say this, if somebody has failed a minimum competency exam 10 times already, I would encourage them to perhaps seek a different profession.
Questions, comments,
I'm
BJ?
going to ask one, because I get the same concerns from teachers that literally have failed this 5, 6, 7 times. And I'm a simple guy, so much like my friend Byron, I like yes or no answers if that's possible. Because they question it and they bring those questions to me. Do you consider our current core content test valid and reliable?
So again, because you have, and I will get to a yes or no on this, because you have more than 60 different examinations, it's not a generic, you can't say generically yes or no for the program. Each one of those examinations needs to stand on its own. And so I would say for the program, the TAC does believe that yes, you have information to support the use and the decisions that are currently being made by individuals for those programs.
Question.
Dr. Bertram?
Yes, Chad, thank you. Thanks for all your work. You mentioned a moment ago when you were comparing these exams to law, LSAT, or the MCAT and other things, say they were not designed to measure the performance or a school's curriculum and instruction, correct?
Somewhat. So you mentioned the LSAT and the MCAT. Those are admissions tests for medical school or law school. I'm talking more about like the bar exam, the actual exam that somebody would take after law school to be potentially eligible for admittance.
Very good, because I was going to use a couple of examples there. That's fine. I'll go to the bar exam for a moment. If a university reported or a law school reported that 30% of their students passed the bar exam, would that be a reflection of the school's performance, in your opinion?
So, would it be a reflection of the school's performance?
And are decisions made about that school based on the passage rate of the bar exam?
So we can talk about that a little bit. Our decisions made, and I believe that in some cases, yes, they are. Now that depends on the jurisdiction. I know that the ABA is actually backing off of that a little bit because, again, bar exams, like other licensure exams, are not designed to align to a program's curriculum and instruction. So from a higher ed institution's perspective, it is likely to their benefit to have students that come out that would be, able to pass an entry-level licensure exam. But the examination itself is not going to be a comprehensive measure. And the thing about evaluating performance of a school, although it might be one indicator, other indicators of the performance of a school may also be impacted by their admission criteria. I do work with the California bar exam, and California is a state that has unaccredited law schools, California accredited law schools, and ABA accredited law schools, and you can imagine that the admission criteria to each of those is slightly different, which means then the ability distribution is slightly different. So when you say, well, is it an indicator of school success? I've got to know more about the context to know whether or not it's a good indicator of that school.
Sure,
success.
but like the LSAT correlates a very strong correlation with the bar passage rate.
I would say moderate. I guess we could debate what's considered strong. There's definitely a moderate correlation, but there's also kind of the ongoing debate as to whether or not the LSAT should be the only indicator. You've got some schools now that are using the graduate record exam as an indicator as well, because those also tend to be correlated.
Okay, so one last question along that line, just to get your perspective. So take any of those exams that are entrance exams or licensure exams. Would it be reasonable that universities, colleges would align their curriculum and instruction to increase the likelihood that students will pass those exams or those licensure exams?
Do I think it would be reasonable? Yes. Have I seen higher ed institutions not be reasonable in this regard? I have. So the extent to which a higher ed institution kind of systematically evaluates their curriculum and instruction relative to the licensure requirements, then yes, I would expect a higher probability of performance if the admission criteria combined with the effectiveness of instruction kind of all lined up to present that. But, you know, I'll stick with my California bar exam for a while. You've got some fairly well-known institutions in California not having great success with their students passing the bar, in large part because they have not aligned their curriculum to what the bar is defined in terms of expectations for entry-level practice.
So when those schools or when those universities have those kind of results, the first place, well, the exam is not the first place they start to examine what's happening with those results, correct?
I'm sorry, I missed part of that. Could you say the first part of that again?
Well, when you have that kind of performance relative to that exam, is it reasonable that the first place you start in trying to understand those outcomes is to go to the exam? Or would you go to the actual instruction and all the other pieces of this?
Well, I think there's probably a natural tendency in most situations to look external to your own responsibility for why something's occurring as it is. And then if you can't, if that can't be explained away, then you have to start to look internally. So, I mean, I think, yes, I think it is natural for higher ed institutions, and again, whether this is in law, dentistry, education, all of these conversations are very common across other professions as well, and which is why you have to kind of go back to, well, what is the actual job? Are you able to link your examination as a licensure exam? Are you able to link that to the important aspects of what is necessary to perform the job? If you can do that, then like the foundation for the validity of the exam, that's kind of where it's based. Then linking back from that to any sort of education or experience that might then also contribute to whether or not a candidate will succeed, helps provide more context to the question. But yeah, I mean, this is where education institutions get upset again across professions if their students don't do well, because they want to instantly kind of blame the exam when the exam is simply intended to be a reflection of practice.
So I want to go back to this, Byron, again. I want to go back to this because I want to make sure I understand, given the other discussion that we've had. What you are saying is, because you said this on the 10 example, and BJ had brought up the 5 to 7 example. You said that given this test and what you know, that you would tell that person to go find another career. That it's not the institution's fault, not the test. That's what I heard. I want to make sure I understand correctly.
Yeah, if somebody, I think what I'm saying is if somebody has failed the exam 10 times and they haven't been provided good guidance about what it takes to succeed on the examination. I used to work at a university. Higher ed institutions do not necessarily want to take full responsibility for candidates who come out from their programs. And so there's actually a case in California around the bar exam where a candidate has failed the exam multiple times, where they turned around, sued the institution for not being able to pass the exam, and the candidate lost in that instance. So, I mean, I'm being a bit facetious in saying find a new career, but ultimately, the information about the examination is public. I mean, the standards on which it's based are public. The profession, information about the profession that this is not clandestine information. And so, yeah, I mean, if somebody told me that they couldn't pass an examination of minimum competency for their profession, and you know, that the evidence suggests that the exam is a reflection of the profession, then yeah, I would probably maybe question career path.
And I wasn't trying to be facetious with my question. I was just trying to know, because we have gotten public comment about this, and we continue to with individuals that have trouble. I want to be able to look them in the eye and know that we have information from the experts telling us that this test is valid and reliable based on the job that they are trying to be licensed to do. Have I said that accurately to my fellow board members to know? I think that's what we have to know. And that's what I'm asking, is just to make sure that that's where we are.
Are you asking, is the exam, I'm repeating back some of the words that the TAC representative used. Are you asking, is the exam a reflection of the profession?
Right.
What's in the exam, does that accurately, how a person performs on it? This whole, at page 3 of the TAC memo, reference to validity about the job analysis studies. Is that what you're trying to pull out?
And that's what I'm asking, because, you know, it was stated that it wasn't an evaluation of the programs, it was an evaluation of the core standards of doing the job, right? And that, to me, is what we've got to know, if that's what it truly does or not.
Shouldn't be alignment there.
May I?
Well, yes, and I guess that's why I keep asking, because I'm confused as to why it wouldn't be, but
Can I just say something very quickly?
Sure.
When I did the original introduction, I failed to mention that there are a series of technical memos in your folders, and I just wanted to make sure everybody understood that that is available. So I apologize for that.
BJ?
I'm going to go back to where Byron started there, because I do have to look these folks in the eye when they can't pass these tests 5, 6, 7 times. And I know that you said as a whole, and I'm not trying to beat a dead horse here, but I just want to be able to truly give them an answer from the experts. As a whole, the group of 60 tests is valid and reliable. Do you consider every test, all 60, valid and reliable?
So each one of the examinations has to be able to stand on its own, and I think it is fair to say that the TAC identified opportunities for additional evidence to be gathered for the program, and then how to go about doing that. I mean, in terms of now. I'll get technical on the second half of this because it's necessary. When we say validity, do we have evidence for each of these programs that some Indiana qualified educators, meaning practitioners in higher ed, looked at the standards, looked at the content of the exam, and said, yes, this is valid information for an entry-level practitioner in Indiana to know and be able to do? Yes. So like for each one of those tests, that sort of information is there. What the TAC has asked for additional evidence is we do think through a job analysis having additional evidence for the program would bolster the claim about that link to practice. Right now it's based largely on those standards kind of as written, and it's good. We think it can be better, I guess, so we're kind of just, maybe asking for best practices as opposed to just acceptable practices. And the practices so far, again, definitely acceptable. I think that the TAC is just, kind of looking for this additional info. The secondary part of your question, valid and reliable. When we get to the reliability piece, reliability is often evaluated statistically. And as I mentioned earlier, reliability, we are often looking at 3 different sources of measurement error. And I don't want anybody to be concerned about when I say measurement error, because we have kind of a margin of error in pretty much any measurement you can think of. In the cognitive world, we evaluate that measurement error often using statistical analyses where we are looking at either the internal consistency of scores, the inter-rater agreement that we might get from human scores looking at like essay questions or performance tasks that are scored. And then for licensure programs in particular, we are looking at something called decision consistency. Now, I would not be truthful in saying that every one of those programs has reliability evidence that meets industry standard. But before anybody panics about that, some of that is driven by the very small sample sizes associated with some of these programs. And in order to calculate any statistic, you need data. And for some of these programs, the sample sizes are very small. And so in those cases, does the reliability evidence kind of meet industry standard? No, but there's a valid reason why it doesn't. Now, for some of the larger programs, some of the reliability indicators are not as strong as we would like to see, and we have offered kind of some technical strategies for how to address and improve upon that. None of them are. I wouldn't say that any of them are so poor as to suggest that you couldn't use the scores or the decisions. It's just that, again, we kind of think there's some opportunities to improve upon practice over time. But that in terms, the reliability piece, as I said, that tends to be a little bit more technical because we're looking at things like KR20 or coefficient alpha, which are internal consistency measures, or a decision consistency measure like Livingston-Lewis or Hansen-Brennan estimate of the probability of correct classification if somebody were to take the exam multiple times. And those are statistics that are calculated. No, things like coefficient alpha and inter-rater agreement, those would be the same sorts of things that you would see on your student assessments. So like, the I-STEP or the I-READ, those sorts of programs. The decision consistency is unique to credentialing exams. Even though we do often look at conditional standard errors or some decision consistency for student classifications, it means more for licensure and certification because that primary question we're trying to answer is, are we confident in the pass-fail decision that we're making for a candidate?
So in your opinion, which of the 60 areas or programs do not currently stand on their own, as you put it?
Honestly, I can't answer that question. I would actually have to walk through each of the 60 questions, or each of the 60 exams. I don't have those pulled up right now.
But you have identified some in the report?
Actually, I don't know if we identified individual. We kind of provided some evaluation criteria. Most testing programs will have evaluation criteria and kind of say, if they don't meet this threshold, find ways to improve upon it, whether by creating items that are more discriminating or lengthening the exam or other sorts of strategies. So it's more around providing some guidance that is a combination of evaluation criteria for statistical thresholds as it intersects with sample size. Because some of the programs will likely never meet some of those properties just because you're not going to have the data to be able to do it.
Okay, let me just try to clarify my question. So have you made a determination that any of our 60 programs do not currently stand on their own?
We have not identified any single exam that could not stand on its own.
Okay, thank you.
I think maybe this, Steve Yeager, I think maybe your answer to Mr. Walker has probably answered my questions. A comment, a couple of comments, and then a question, please. So if a student in education from University of Illinois determines that they want to move to Indiana, they have to take these tests as well. I'm looking at anybody.
I'm sorry, ask me again.
If somebody transfers in from out of state, they have to take these tests, correct?
No, I don't think so. Is that right? They don't have to.
Reciprocal license.
Yeah. If they already have a license.
If they get a license from University of Illinois, they can skate in and not
From a
take these
different
tests.
state, yes.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, so you can go to Kentucky and test.
There's
You go to Kentucky.
reciprocity in
Yeah, we have reciprocity, yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Come in.
Uh,
They have to have taken a similar kind of exam in Illinois and been granted an Illinois license in order to receive a reciprocal Indiana license.
Yeah, let me go further. What I heard you kind of recommending, maybe sideways a little bit earlier, was that universities adjust their curriculum to the test, that these students are not passing, which is what we get hammered for all the time in public education, is teaching to the test. That's just a comment. Are there specific tests, and Mr. Walker, I think, asked this question maybe in a little different way. Are there specific tests that are failed more often out of the 60 than other tests? And if so, should we be concentrating on those tests? Because what I hear a lot of is social studies and math, specifically at the middle school level. Should we be concentrating or focusing on those tests rather than a generic overall statement?
That's a good question, and it's definitely an intuitive concept to think that like pass rates or failure rates should potentially kind of drive policy decisions. I want to dissuade you from that approach for a couple of reasons, and offer maybe a different strategy. So the primary reason that we don't necessarily want to look at pass or failure rates is because it's largely a function of the ability distribution of the people who sign up to take the test. So if you have an examination, each exam again kind of stands on its own. So to compare pass or failure rates across exams, you're comparing multiple different subpopulations to each other that we have no reasonable expectation would be comparable to begin with. And so the pass failure rates do not necessarily need to be comparable at the outset. The secondary part of that is that because the sample sizes for these are dramatically different, percentages are essentially a standardized score on a 0 to 100% scale. Those can be dramatically influenced. Let's say I have 5 people taking the exam. Well, if I have a pass rate of 40% on one, well, that means 2 out of 5 people passed versus, well, if 3 people passed, it's an increase of 20%. It's only 1 additional person. It doesn't really mean that much. And so those sorts of comparisons can be misleading. Where I would encourage you to consider alternatively is, again, remembering that the purpose of the core assessments largely is for licensure and public protection. What I would do is I would probably triage a little bit and say, well, which are the largest fields? Which are the programs that have the largest numbers of candidates taking the exam, which then has the potential larger ripple effect on teachers interacting with students in the state. So the larger the program, that's where I would potentially look at for my starting point to kind of say, hey, this has the greatest potential impact on the public. This is where I might want to focus my efforts, and then kind of work my way down through the system. Just from a kind of a risk to the public or risk to the system sort of perspective, along with any sort of factors that might influence whether or not you want to, relook or redevelop an examination. Like maybe, I know like within CTE, there's been some changes nationally in the last few years around some of the kind of the, industry standards for practice there, or maybe there's, I'm thinking about like the next gen science standards. To what extent are those reflected, within the different science competencies for educators in Indiana? So things like that, in addition to the volume of a respective part of the program, may be kind of substantive influencing factors for when you would want to revisit or relook at an exam.
This is a question, kind of a follow-up, and probably to staff here. When I ask about out-of-state education candidates moving from out-of-state to a school district in Indiana, and I think I heard that they also have to take some sort of a praxis, and do we know, similar to what our kiddos have to take, do we know that those are comparable to ours?
If that's a question for me, I mean, we don't. We don't do any sort of cross-state comparison. As I've kind of mentioned to Tim and the team, there's really only two vendors in this teacher licensure space. ETS has the Praxis series, which is a kind of a shelf product, and then Evaluation Systems creates custom or kind of jurisdiction-specific examinations for the program. And so it'll depend on which state a candidate comes from. If a candidate, from what I think I overheard, was if a candidate has been licensed in another state, you probably have some sort of reciprocity program.
Yes.
Or reciprocity with licensure plus maybe some experience that they would have to have, versus if they went to school in, say, Illinois, but wanted to practice in Indiana. This is, again, kind of why it's important for the exam to ultimately reflect practice and not just what may be kind of Indiana-specific curriculum for higher education, because it could be seen as a barrier to entry to practice if if the knowledge of a particular curriculum is not necessary to be effective in the classroom.
So I'm going to look at staff now. When I asked the question earlier, we kind of looked at each other and weren't sure what the answer was. We don't know. You're going to have to come up to the microphone.
I don't think we know for sure how close they are.
Then we probably don't
Depend
know.
on the state in which they're coming from and what the test vendor is and what that test looks like.
We probably don't know if there's a higher success rate from any given state that would be able to move in through the law of reciprocity, be able to move into the state of Indiana. We don't know if Kentucky students are more successful than Illinois or Michigan or Ohio.
How is reciprocity determined? Do we have reciprocity with 49 states?
We do now.
Okay. So let me give you an example. 2
Yeah.
years ago, we had a science exam for teachers. And the initial pass rate was under 30%. The recommendation came to this board to change the cut score. And that's all we did. We changed the cut score, and then over 80% passed. No change in instruction, no change. People didn't repeat the exam. The exam didn't change. We simply changed the cut score. So essentially, every state has the flexibility to do that, correct?
Yeah, I would assume.
So basically, any of those teachers that we licensed in Indiana, by changing a cut score, could go to any state and have reciprocity potentially.
I would assume, as long as they have that in place in their state.
Where do I go?
I obviously wasn't here yet, but from what I understand, they looked at several tests, and they did change a couple of cut scores and actually left several of them the same.
Yeah, I mean, we jumped almost 60 points, right, with one decision. So if I'm a prospective candidate for teaching, where do I go to learn about a particular university's pass rate on these exams?
So you can find that on our website. We have a whole webpage dedicated to it.
So everything goes back to each
shows every
preparation
institution,
program.
shows exact pass rates for every test. I mean, they can find all that data there.
You just go to DOE website, and you can. University is not required to publish that information.
Yeah, we collect all of that.
But they're not required to publish it, correct?
I don't think they are.
Or disclose it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Would there also be, this just spurred the question, would there be ability, because the other thing we've heard in this testimony from different folks, that they have used the remediation things that our company provides for that, right? Is there data on how well that does? So if I didn't pass the first time and I did the purchased the remediation, because we're hearing thousands of dollars that people have used. If I've purchased, what's my odds of passing? Am I making sense with that question? Do we have that data?
We don't. I mean, I don't think we would
Can we
know
get
from
that data?
person to person who uses what. support materials to prepare
But
for the
they'd have
test.
to purchase it.
Well, maybe. There's other.
Okay.
Yeah, there's other stuff out there too. So, but we don't have that. I mean, we obviously have, multiple pass rate data and people who've taken it more than one time and what that looks like and all that. But
I was going to say, we do have the multiple test taker
Correct.
data in terms of if they are
One or
repeat
more.
test takers and how many then are the success rate and pass rates of those. But I would say this, though, Byron, having teachers in my building who need to take it multiple times and looking at it, I mean, there is minimal free support online, but because we have our own test and we don't take something off the shelf like Praxis, we have very minimal support. I mean, our young people who are trying to pass this and who don't the first time and then try to look for remediation aren't able to get a book that helps them pass it. Right. And then, so online they have a practice test that's 10 questions. And, that's the remediation you're offered is 10 practice questions. And so that's not a lot of remediation for students who, need help.
So to that point, Chad, I'm going to put you on the spot again. You won't answer this, so you'll do what you've been doing. But I'm kidding here. Are we? But to Carrie's point, because that's a good point, right? So I hope you take this as being serious. And I was kidding there. Sorry, and I shouldn't have been. Are we using the right product?
I mean, you only have a choice of two products. And so whether it's the right product or not, I mean, the question is to what extent does does the product that you're using align with the practice of, the entry-level practice of teaching in Indiana? And I think, again, in using the evaluation system and processes, you've tried to design something that is that has been adapted to Indiana's needs. Now, again, from this perspective of, I would challenge the notion that there should be remediation materials, and the reason why, again, is this is not a classroom test. This is not an education test, and so it's like that sort of perspective fits very well in kind of the K-12 environment, or if I were doing, say, a higher education outcomes assessment. But when you kind of shift over into the credentialing space, licensure or certification, it's not really the purpose. And so the extent to which there are kind of materials to help you prepare, I think one of the other members mentioned a moment ago, well, you start to have concerns about teaching to the test. And this is from an education standpoint, this is my little editorialized piece here, but teaching to the test is actually not really that big a deal. It's teaching the test that's problematic, that narrows the curriculum. If the test is ultimately a good sample of what you want to measure, and that sample of the domain changes over time, then the standards linked to the test, you should be teaching to the standards broadly. And again, from an education perspective, that's a good thing. And so we kind of use that phrasing pejoratively, but it's not necessarily a bad thing because we do want this link in education among curriculum and assessment and instruction. But within licensure and certification, that primary link needs to be between practice, the actual practice of teaching, and the assessment. And so that's kind of where we would sit in that regard.
So can I ask one more follow-up, please? So this one I think you can answer yes or no to. If all the things are done that are outlined in the memos and the stuff that we've gotten, you have confidence that we should be confident in these core exams.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, our perspective again kind of comes from a combination of the industry standards, and then I will freely admit that part of the perspective that we're bringing to this is that there are legal challenges to credentialing programs, and specifically to education licensure programs. And so, part of what we're wanting to help with is to kind of help bolster the evidentiary case for the program as a whole. And so, yes, I think collectively I can speak for the TAC and say that if the plans kind of align with good practice and are implemented with fidelity, then yes, in fact, if anything, it's just going to boost your confidence. I don't think you should have a lack of confidence now. I just think it would really strengthen your argument.
So then, Dr. McCormick, if I could ask you a question then. When do you, because you've obviously, I'm sure, been thinking through this, or here, I don't know, that, or you've been thinking about this, I'm sure. When would you say, given what we have, that we would have, that our company would have this fixed?
Marcia, do you want to answer that? I'm not sure fix is the right word.
Well, or what I'm saying is, somehow we have to hold our vendor account. I mean, I'm maybe speaking out of term here. I don't know how do you hold the vendor accountable at this point to get these things done, or is there agreement that these things should be done, and when would that happen? You know, would we not renew a contract till they were done, or how? I'm just asking because I don't know.
In any assessment, there is always ongoing validation, ongoing review, and that is what is occurring here. We are establishing a timeline for the vendor. The vendor has already begun a number of these. Now, these are going to take place, and Dr. Birkendahl will correct me if I'm wrong. This will take a long period of time. These are not things that are done in 3 months. And a timeline is being established, and the vendor's contract will be amended to include that timeline. In addition, PAC is overseeing the timeline, the completion as things are scheduled to be completed. So this is in place. As I say, the vendor is even beginning. Then it will be put into the contract to ensure that it is completed.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions for Chad? Excuse me.
Thank you, Chad.
Thank you, Chad.
Thanks,
I do have one more question.
I'm sorry, Chad,
Thanks,
just a minute.
everyone.
Chad,
one more question.
I'm sorry, I do have one more question. Have you
Okay.
seen in any of your work across the country, are there reasonable indicators that would create a process for people to get licensed who do not pass the exam? That could demonstrate competency in other ways.
So, okay, within teacher licensure, so I'll give examples of a couple different approaches I have seen some states take, and then I will kind of add then the caution of the risk of doing that. So usually true licensure says that the credential is mandatory before you are allowed to practice. Within teacher licensure, we often see situations where, whether it's through alternate certification or through, again, maybe a practitioner who comes, a licensed practitioner who comes from another state, but perhaps with less than 5 years experience, may be granted like a temporary credential or a temporary or an interim license, provisional license, whatever some of the language is, in order to practice, with the condition that they then have to maybe pass a pedagogy test or a content-specific test or something that is kind of state-specific. So there, again, these sort of different pathways are potentially there. Ultimately, you would still want some sort of demonstration of competence, and the challenge if you try to have kind of like different approaches, like let's say a project-based or a portfolio-based sort of strategy, is you create potentially parallel systems that then you have to demonstrate comparability from an equity standpoint to make sure that the kind of the standard of care associated with one pathway is equal to the other. The caution in doing something like that, the additional caution in doing something like that, if you're allowing people in on kind of a provisional credential and then requiring them to pass an examination or do some sort of competency demonstration to retain their job, that's ultimately why New York got in so much trouble with their teacher certification exam. Back in the early 90s, they had major teacher shortages. They let a whole bunch of people in on kind of provisional credentials with the expectation that they would then have to pass the series of examinations to be licensed. Well, in doing so, they then ultimately shifted the intent of that examination from being a credentialing exam that was simply only designed to to measure kind of entry-level competency to then becoming an employment test, because they were then making decisions on whether somebody retained their job or were eligible for promotion based on whether or not they could pass these entry-level examinations. The burden of care then shifts, and then there's this whole different set of expectations that apply through the 1978 Uniform Guidelines, which now starts to talk about employment testing and how you use tests and how they're validated. So I guess my caution is, if you're looking at different pathways to try to ensure access to good quality teaching, you want to make sure that those pathways are comparable for equity purposes, but also that you don't potentially unintentionally shift the use of the test, because if you shift the use of the test, your vendor is ultimately going to have to collect additional evidence to help you then support the use of the test for that new purpose.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chad.
Sure.
Tim, do you have
Thanks, everyone.
Tim, do you have anything to add?
I do not. Dr. Buckendall, thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and cut off the line. Okay. Thank you. Take
Do
care.
we have a motion to adjourn?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? We are adjourned. Thank you.